Are you adopting in the state of Arizona, or is Arizona one of the states that you're considering adopting from? If so, then you need to check out my conversation today with Kristy Blackwell. Kristy is an adoption attorney in the state of Arizona. And not only is she a wealth of knowledge, but she really allows us to break down the entire process from start to finish and dive deep into those steps that can be a little extra confusing, especially when you're just starting out in your adoption journey. But before we dive into our conversation with Kristy, let me take just a minute to introduce myself in case we haven't met yet. My name is Amanda, and I'm an adoptive mom on a mission to help hopeful adoptive families reduce overwhelm and unnecessary expense in your adoption journey. I do this by step-by-step videos like this, as well as through a series of training courses that are really designed to help you have an easier adoption journey. If you haven't already done so, I sure would appreciate it if you would take just a minute to smash that subscribe button and hit the like so that you help me share this message with other hopeful adoptive families out there. Without further ado, let's jump into our conversation with Kristy. Kristy, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. We are so excited to learn everything we can about adoption law in Arizona. But before we dive into that, do you mind to share just a little bit more about yourself with the audience?
Sure. I've been practicing law for about 19 years, most of that doing adoption work. I started out, as many of us did, maybe in family law. Quickly learned I didn't enjoy that very much. So I started building the side of my practice that was adoption. And so now that's all I do exclusively is adoptions and things around adoption. Guardianships, terminations, all of that type of thing. And I've been a member of the Academy of Adoption and Artificial Reproduction Attorneys since 2013 and just finished 4 years as the president of the Arizona Adoption Coalition.
Awesome. Well, thank you for all of that you've done for our country as it relates to adoption, and specifically in Arizona. That is quite interesting. I'd love if we could just dive into a general overview of adoption law in Arizona, if you don't mind.
Sure. Like a lot of people say about their own states, I think that we're pretty adoption friendly. In Arizona, when a mom signs her consent, it's irrevocable. So we have no revocation period, which many prospective adoptive parents like. And we also have a process for dealing with prospective adopter or potential fathers. A potential father is one who's not married before birth, so that we can deal with that issue before birth. So we're limiting the risk to an adoption. And that way we can get to finalization sooner for most families.
Wow, that is very adoption friendly, I would say, from a hopeful adoptive parent's perspective. So in the state of Arizona, are you following what I would call a typical process whereby a hopeful adoptive family would have a home study that would give them the kind of initial approval to proceed to pursue an adoption in the state of Arizona, and then working with some sort of professional or on your own to then potentially match your adoption? Would those be kind of like the two fundamental pillars, if you will, to begin the adoption process in Arizona?
Absolutely. So Arizona's home study process is a little bit different than most. When you hire somebody to prepare your home study, they'll complete it and then it gets submitted to the court for what's called certification. So then the judge then has 60 days to review it and then either certify a prospective adoptive parent as acceptable to adopt or not certify them. Of course, they can go through an appeals process if they're not certified. Most of the time, somebody will know they're going to get certified just by working with their home study provider. So the home study can take a little longer to get in place in Arizona because of that extra step of going through the court for certification. But then once they are certified to adopt, that's how we say it in Arizona, as opposed to home study approved. Once they're certified to adopt, they can work with any adoption professional so long as they are licensed in the state that they're in. So that could be an attorney licensed in their state or an agency licensed in any state. They're not permitted to work with what some of us call a facilitator, which would be somebody who takes payment for a match, but they are not a licensed attorney or agency. But otherwise, they can work with anybody who's licensed for their matching services.
Awesome. And when it comes to kind of those steps in between the certification and then choosing kind of their partner to match, when they're working on their profile, they're allowed to work with someone on their profile as long as they're not paying that individual to match them with an expectant family. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. So maybe somebody who calls themselves an adoption consultant, that's okay because they're paying for services, not necessarily for the match. And that's also true for advertising. So if they wanted to post their profile on a website or an app that hosts adoptive parent profiles, they can do that because the payment is for their subscription and not necessarily for a specific match. So that's permitted.
That totally makes sense. Awesome. So when it comes to the overall process then, so once they're certified, then they're going to work on their profile and potentially do that during that 60-day window that they're becoming certified so that way they're ready to start sharing it at that instance. And then they're working into matching. And those steps don't necessarily vary whether or not you're working with an agency or an attorney. Would you say that that's correct?
Yes, yeah. And I know some adoption professionals have a very specific idea of what they want that adoption profile to look like. Many attorneys were a little bit more flexible on it. But if you're trying to match through a specific agency, they may want you to use their form. But in general, an adoption profile can be used for different matching services once they've got that put together.
Okay. Yeah.
Some of us professionals, we like to have their direct information on the profile book, and some adoption professionals do not want it. So my advice to my clients is to create your book without it. And then for those of us that like it, you can just put that on an address label and stick it on the back. That way you're not creating different books for different matching services or agencies and attorneys.
That's a really great idea. So when it comes to really choosing your adoption professionals in your state, do you have any tips for them as it relates to just kind of things that they should look for? I know this is kind of a bonus question, but since we're here and talking about it, I thought that someone, in the state of Arizona could really help guide folks into what are the areas that they should be looking for.
Well, I think it's important for prospective adoptive parents to consider having more than one matching service that they're working with. So when they come to me, I talk to them always about what else they should be doing and who else they should be working with. And I think if prospective adoptive parents are working with 3, 4, maybe even 5 different matching venues is what I call them, as long as they're low cost entry, right, then it increases their chances of getting a match and it increases maybe finding the right match for them. And I always advise them, if it's somebody who says you should only work with me, they should consider, are they really watching out for your best interest or for their own? So I encourage my clients to work with other people as well and try to include one agency if they can afford it.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I often tell my clients that you should consider multiple methods of matching, right? And you should share your profile in as many ways as are legally possible and you feel comfortable with in your state, right? So if you don't feel comfortable recording a TikTok video, then don't create a TikTok account, right? And if you don't feel comfortable including, a phone number on your profile or on your website, then maybe don't do those things, but make sure you understand what's legal in your state. And then the more you share it, quite honestly, the greater opportunity you have to match ultimately.
I absolutely agree. And I think you can have contact information that's not necessarily the information you use all the time. So you can use an email like kristywantstoadopt@gmail.com, something like that. It doesn't have to be the email address or the phone number you've had for the last 20 years.
Exactly. I often recommend either getting like a Google Voice number because that comes to your phone on your app, or you can, go as extreme as getting a whole nother cell phone number specifically for your adoption as well.
Sure. Exactly.
Yeah. So, wow, we've already covered a lot of ground here in just the first couple of minutes here. But as it relates to, the overall process, just to recap for the audience, you're going to get a home study. You're going to choose which types of, methods of matching you're going to use, right? You're going to line up all of those partners, right? Whether it be, an agency or your attorney, you're going to make sure you have everyone kind of on board. You're going to get officially certified and create your profile, share your profile, and finalize it. And then when it comes to then at the matching phase, right, then let's take just a minute to talk a little bit more about that in particular. So in the matching phase, there's going to be a couple of more steps that are going to happen in that phase as well, right? You're going to create that have that initial conversation with an expectant family. And depending upon how you're matching, that could come through your attorney or through the agency. And then at that stage, that's where a lot of questions come in from our audience, typically as it relates to what is allowed in the state from an adoption law perspective. Would you mind to talk a little bit more about what kind of support and things that are allowed from the legal perspective?
Sure. So we handle living expenses, I think, pretty easily here. We have a pretty clear statute on it that says that prospective adoptive parents can help with reasonable and necessary living expenses during the pregnancy, and then for a 6-week recovery period, 8 weeks if she has a C-section. So reasonable and necessary is not defined by statute, but what we often see is, if needed, could include rent, could include paying for her cell phone so that the minutes don't run out and we lose her, could include helping with food, things like that. Counseling and medical expenses are often covered for the birth mother, but they're outside of what we define as living expenses. If they're going to exceed a total of $1,000 throughout the entire process, then they must be approved by the court before we exceed that $1,000 limit. So we'll have that expectant mother sign an affidavit that details exactly what is needed and what she's anticipating receiving. And we'll file it with a motion. And once it's approved by the court, then we can exceed that $1,000. But one of the benefits of it is then we create a very specific budget that she can expect and rely on, and the prospective adoptive parents can expect and rely on. And most of the time, those monies go through the attorney or the agency. Yeah. There's not a specific statute saying that the adoptive parents cannot do it. We just find that creates a weird relationship, and we don't want that to happen. So in my office, it always goes through us, and we pay as much of it directly as we can to the landlord, to Verizon, wherever it might be. Right. Just depending on each mother's needs, and they can vary dramatically. Sometimes I have clients that don't need any living expenses at all, and some of our expectant mothers have a lot of need. So that's how we handle those as well. But during that time frame after the match, we're also not just helping her with her financial need. We may set up counseling for her. We may start discussing the openness agreement and getting that put in place before placement happens. Yeah. That way, I think it makes the expectant mother feel much more comfortable about signing her consent for adoption if the openness agreement has already been signed.
Yeah, I think that is honestly the sign of a great partner, that you're thinking about those elements, because those are really important. I often tell my hopeful adoptive families that are interviewing potential adoption professional partners to, ask, how does the transaction conversation, really work when it comes to money, right? If she calls and says, I need gas money, how is that handled, right? But then you also have to be preparing for the relationship that you're going to have after finalization. Because what you want to make sure is that you're on the same page, right? That you have the same vision of this child's life and everyone's involvement in that child's life from the very beginning, because you don't want to have any surprises, or you want to avoid as many surprises as you can after birth.
For sure. Yeah, I always tell my clients, if you're going to maybe take her to an OB appointment, you want to stop at Subway, get her a little food, that's always okay. That's just being nice to somebody in your life. But if ever requested money happens, there's only one right answer, and that's to blame it on me. I don't remember. Let me run it by the lawyer. I don't want to do anything wrong, and then make me the bad guy. Happy to do it. Anytime they're uncomfortable, that's the right answer, is punt it, make it the attorney's problem.
That's right. That's right. Right. And then honestly, if you're not sure, always err on the side of asking, because you don't want to do something to put your opportunity at jeopardy, for sure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So then once baby is born, we talked about revocation period as being really not, something that we focus on in the state of Arizona. But can you talk about and unpack how revocation and even to finalization works in a little bit more detail for the audience?
For sure. So any parent cannot sign their consent for adoption until the child is at least 72 hours old. So that's 3 days. But once they sign it, of course, they can sign it after 72 hours, just not before. Once they sign it, it is irrevocable. So we don't have that window of uncertainty, but there is a longer waiting period. So hopefully baby and mom are healthy and they're going to be discharged before that 72 hours. And that is common in our state because of our 72-hour rule. So what she'll do is she'll sign that hospital third-party authorization form to release the child to a third party. And that's the prospective adoptive parents. Sometimes they'll also request a power of attorney, which we can facilitate. And then the adoptive parents will take baby to their home if they live here, hotel or Airbnb if they don't, and then wait until the legal process can be completed. And then she'll sign with her attorney privately. She doesn't need to go to court sometime after that 72-hour period. And then it's irrevocable. If we have a birth father involved, he can also sign, but the same 72-hour rule applies to him if he's involved.
Okay. And if he's not involved or not named, how does that work in the state of Arizona?
So an identified potential father, meaning she's not married to him, but she's identified a potential father, he can be served with what's called a potential father's notice. Some people just say adoption notice anytime during the pregnancy. It could be as early as 7 weeks pregnant. And once he's served, he has 30 days to go to the family court and file a paternity action saying, I want to be identified as the father and I want to start paying child support. I want custody orders. I want all of that. And if he doesn't file and serve it within 30 days, we don't need anything else from him. So it's really ideal to serve him early in the process if possible. And it's rare for them to actually go take the necessary steps if within that 30-day period, but it gives them the opportunity to do so. It's kind of shifting the burden. If you want to interrupt the adoption plan and parent, this is what you need to do, but you don't have a long period of time to do it.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think it's really important to note that some other states call it a putative father, and they talk about putative father registries and all of that. So it is different in the state of Arizona if you've been watching kind of this legal series, if you will, from that perspective. So don't get confused that is still a dynamic that comes into play.
It is. We actually have 3 types of fathers in Arizona. So maybe we should address that briefly. Yeah. One is a presumed legal father. That's a husband. And I can't serve him with a notice. He has elevated rights that we have to deal with differently. He must either sign the consent as well, or I have to terminate his parental rights if I have a ground to do so. So I always remind my clients, ask if she's married, ask if she's married. I would say at least 20% of the clients I work with, they are married. And usually there's a way we can get around it, but we need to know so that we can deal with it. The second type of father is that potential father we already talked about. And so that's whoever she's identified as the birth father or birth fathers. And then third is we do have a putative father registry.
Oh, okay.
And so we do search that. We can't search it until the child is at least 30 days old. And that's to catch a name that maybe she didn't tell us about. And so that protects the rights of a man she didn't identify. But if he is not on that registry within 30 days of birth, then nobody else is entitled to the notice. And we can terminate rights on that alone. Okay. So some people say, well, what if he doesn't know about the registry? The act that created the child was his notice.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So that is a great clarification. Thank you for that.
Sure.
So then you are then finalizing the adoption after those 30 days?
Yes. So we finalize quicker here than most states. So if we're finalizing in the state of Arizona, for a newborn adoption, that can be as soon as 90 days after we file that petition for adoption. So approximately when baby's 3 months old, because we only require that one post-placement supervision report. However, if the Arizona baby is going to a family out of state, non-residents are not permitted to finalize an adoption in Arizona unless they're adopting one of our foster children. So if you're coming to Arizona for a private adoption, you'll need to finalize that adoption in your home state when you get there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you are adopting a child from Arizona but don't live in the state of Arizona, I would assume the Interstate Compact for the Placement of Children still applies as it does in other states.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, which basically gives you permission to leave the state with the child once the state of Arizona has spoken with your home state and they've both agreed that you will then finalize the adoption in your home state. Is that
that's always included in the ICPC package for sure. And our Arizona ICPC administrator is very efficient. So right now, sometimes we can clear our home state, our sending state of Arizona within a few hours. Oh, wow. Most states, it could be a few days, which is still very reasonable. But right now, it's pretty efficient to run ICPC through Arizona.
Yeah. I oftentimes tell people, be prepared just in case it's not, because you never know. I was one of those unfortunate souls way before COVID that spent 3 weeks in Florida waiting for permission to come home.
That's a long time.
It's a long time. It's a very expensive trip when it's that long. And you're just at that point, you're anxious to go home. So prepare just in case, but always hope for the best.
Yes, I always tell people, but remember, we can't even submit ICPC until she has signed her consent. So that's already 3 days that we're waiting, and then we can submit it.
Yeah, for sure. And as you touched on briefly earlier, choose a place that you feel comfortable hanging out with baby for those days, right? Whether it's a hotel or an Airbnb, just, think through those logistics as well.
For sure. You got to be able to warm up those bottles.
That's right. Exactly. And the ability to do laundry might not be a bad thing from time to time.
Oh, for sure. Yes.
Oh, well, this has been so helpful. So I've got a few more questions, if you don't mind,
Sure.
from our audience. So typically, I get a lot of questions in my direct messages on Instagram and Facebook, specifically around self-matching or independent matching. And based upon our conversation, I'm thinking that that is legally allowed in the state of Arizona. But do you mind just to touch upon that as well?
Sure, absolutely. We see a lot of self matches and they happen in a variety of ways. I've even had a client who their waitress was pregnant. They made friends with her over that hour and a half. They met up a week later and they absolutely had a very successful open adoption. So
Wow.
that's not very common, but it shows how self matches happen in a lot of ways. So I really encourage my prospective adoptive parent clients to be open to that and to talk to other people about how they're hoping to adopt. Because the people in your life that know and love you are your best advocates.
That's right.
They hear about an opportunity somewhere else. They're absolutely going to advocate for you, tell you about it. So self-matching happens a lot. And in fact, in Arizona, if you self-match while you're still in the process of getting your home study certified to adopt, we can still help you. We just can't match a non-certified family. So by statute, agencies and attorneys, we're not permitted to share your profile book until you're certified to adopt. But if you self-match and give us a call, then there's a process where we can go to the court and get temporary custody pending the certification. And those happen, I get a few every year just like that.
Yeah, that is awesome to hear that that is still a possibility so you can keep things moving forward. But, if you're hoping to adopt, you definitely should take the necessary steps to, begin the process of becoming certified. And I often, encourage people to do that and then work on, your profile book as we shared earlier.
You'll
But
need
I think
that certification for ICPC though. So if you self-match out of state, a little different. Because you definitely need that home study totally certified for ICPC.
that makes sense. But you touched on something there that I think is really important for our audience to keep in mind as it relates to your profile. So you want to have something that's easy for people to share and digest and get to know you, right? So if your friends and family are sharing on your behalf, you're not going to pass out a million books, right, to hand out. But if you're going to, your friends and family are going to share maybe a business card with a QR code that links to a website, right, where they can get to know you a little bit more and then decide to reach out to you, or maybe just your phone number to, like text me, on that business card. And really think through how people can advocate on your behalf and equip them with something that's not cumbersome or burdenful to them, but also think about when it gets to the, expectant family, they may not be in the position at that moment that they want to share and advertise that they're considering adoption. So have something that they can discreetly tuck away and, maybe not the big, book to, haul around at that moment.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of the card, whether it's a QR code or a link or something. And then maybe even at a holiday, Christmas, whatever, include that in your Christmas card and send Christmas cards to twice as many people as you normally would.
That's right.
Holiday where nobody gets a card. Send me an Easter card with that information in there. I'll remember it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. Having easy access to your information and a way to find your bio is great. It could be a Facebook page even, whatever it is.
Exactly. It does not have to be complicated or expensive at all. I mean, you can print business cards on, those websites for like $20 for like several hundred of them, right? So
yeah, that's a great idea. Mm-hmm.
I love that. Just a little bonus tip. So then when we work after, kind of into the finalization stage, then the adoption is legally binding and you're really kind of just moving into what I call the post-placement stage. You're moving into just parenting and making sure that you really hold up your end of those connection agreements. Would there be anything else that we would be missing in that stage of the process?
Well, for Arizona, if we're using an Arizona openness agreement, we call those PACAs or post-adoption communication agreements. They are enforceable in court. So they get signed by the adoptive parents, the birth parents, and then eventually the judge. So those might get enforced. It's pretty rare because most adoptive parents are very good about honoring them. But of course, that agreement also states that if somebody fails to honor it for any reason, that's never grounds to set aside an adoption. But the judge could enforce, hey, you forgot to send your updates and pictures, do so now. We'll follow up in 30 days, but never to set aside an adoption. But that often makes the mom feel much more confident about signing her consent, knowing that it is enforceable. So, of course, you want to make sure that you follow up with that because as you're a new parent with a newborn, you're going to get busy. It doesn't mean you didn't mean to. You could miss those deadlines, maybe calendar them. Those are important to keep that relationship in place. And something I recently learned at a conference that I think was invaluable that a lot of adoptive parents may not think of is, well, but I told my child when they were 2 and we've read that book and they know they're adopted. A 2-year-old brain is going to absorb that differently than a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old and a 12-year-old. And so it's really important to continue to bring it up and talk about it so that they feel safe to ask their questions, which will be different at those different ages. And that way they always feel open and safe at home and not worried about whether their adoptive mom, who I like to call real mom, whether it's going to hurt feelings, right? And so I really encourage my adoptive parents to keep opening that conversation with your child because it will build a stronger relationship and make them feel safer.
Yeah, I'm so glad you touched upon that. As an adoptive mom, we use what I call age-appropriate language to talk about adoption in our life. So for my littles, or when they were little, we would talk about how they grew in my heart and not in my belly, and how they grew in another mommy's belly, right? And those types of things. And now that my daughter is 7 and my son is soon to be 5, we use different language and we talk about them with their first names. And mommy, this person, I don't say their names to protect their identity, but, mommy, this person. And, my daughter will ask questions about, I wonder what she's doing today. Or, there was a solar eclipse recently, or lunar eclipse, recently. And we were talking about it. And she was like, I wonder if she saw that too, And so really embracing those types of moments, and to your point, making safe space for that, because you always want to be, especially as their mom, their safe harbor, right? And having those conversations open. So I love that. For sure.
Right. Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the PACA, as you called it? Can you talk about, kind of the common things that hopeful adoptive parents need to begin wrapping their minds around as it relates to the types of updates or the types of contact that are typical in kind of the post-adoptive space?
Sure. Because open adoption, there's a huge spectrum of what that might mean, right? So most of them include some level of providing updates and pictures. Sometimes we'll use a third-party site for that. There's a few different companies that provide that service. Some of our clients, they just want to do it through email. So that's another good reason to have your adoption email set up. But some of our birth mothers may not always have access to email, or maybe that changes a lot. So we try to be flexible with how she wants those to happen. And then we set up a schedule. They can always share more, but I always say this is the bare minimum. This is how much you're promising to send. Yeah. And it's usually maybe more frequent in the first year or 2, maybe even as much as monthly, but then it tends to go back a little bit, maybe to quarterly, and then twice a year, and then maybe at the end of once a year. Sometimes we're only talking about the first 5 years, and sometimes we're talking about all 18. And then separately, we'll have a section on maybe in-person visits. I try to encourage my clients, at least for the PACA, let's just talk about visits for the first 5 years. After that, maybe you have such a strong relationship, you can keep doing them for as long as you want. You're the parents. But sometimes an expectant mother really wants it in there for all 18 years, and we can do that. And then I always like to include language that's very clear that everybody agrees on about whether the birth mom can post photos of the child online or not. Most of the time, we agree not without the adoptive or legal parent's permission. Of course, she can share them with her close family and friends, but that's different than sharing on social media.
Yeah.
And then I always like to include something in there that I think helps the birth mom feel confident that the legal parents agree to create a will where they name any guardian, of course, that they want for their own child, but that the guardians also promise to honor the agreement.
Oh, that's a good addition. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of how PACAs work here. And occasionally, if baby's going to another state, if it violates that state law, then we have to do a good faith agreement, but we try to include basically the same information in there. Most of the time, people are very honest and true to it, and they're going to honor it anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. I'm sure you saw the light bulb moment go off in my brain of like, that's not in my will. I should do that myself. Thanks for the suggestion.
Of course, if it's somebody you know and trust, they probably would honor it, but
yeah, but do they have the details and know what to do? That's always a good thing to do.
Sure, yeah.
Make sure that's captured, because of course that sits in my brain and on my computer, right?
Yeah, of course.
That is very good. Well, this has been really, really helpful. I have a couple more questions as it relates to self-matching before we kind of wrap up. So we talked about self-matching is allowed. Can you talk about paid advertising, specifically if they were, I'll give a few examples because I know examples always help. If they were paying, a social media platform or paying for Google ads, or maybe even paying for one of those matching kind of apps that exist or websites that exist, are those elements allowed under state law when it comes to self-matching in Arizona?
Yes, all of our prospective adoptive parents can do all of those things. So the only thing that is not permitted is the facilitator type thing that we talked about before. So the advertising is all okay here.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, those are the primary questions that our audience always asks me to ask, but I'd love to know if there are any additional things that you'd like to touch upon or that you think is really important for, prospective parents to know as they're getting started in their adoption journey.
Sure. One of the tips that I like to give prospective adoptive parents is as they're working with their different matching venues, they're all going to have their own requirements, right? And many of them like the prospective adoptive parents to fill out maybe an adoption preference checklist, what they're looking for with gender, race, the level of drug exposure, things like that. Yeah. And my suggestion is that you are way more open on there than you think that you are, because you can always say, no, I don't think this is the right opportunity for me. But you never get to say yes to something you didn't hear about. Mm. You might also check a box that says I'm only able to pay up to $5,000 in living expenses, but then you don't hear about the one that was like perfect otherwise and she wanted $6,500. Maybe you would have been willing to make that adjustment given the situation. So don't be too restrictive on that list. And if you start restrictive at the beginning of your journey and you start to feel differently, remember to update those lists.
Yeah. That is a really great tip. Yeah, you never know what you don't know, right? And so to your point, there are some times that you're like, I can make that adjustment. I am okay with that with additional research, or this situation is a little bit different.
Sure.
And you just never know. I often, as we went through our own process, I would call, either my OB or I would call a pediatrician, right? And I kind of had them on standby, if you will, to ask questions that I just didn't feel educated enough to answer. But to your point, we left our restrictions pretty open because that gave us the opportunity to see more opportunities and really decide if we were okay with that.
That's great. Another one I like to say to Arizona families is to not be afraid of the Indian Child Welfare Act. We often refer to it as ICWA, but in Arizona, we only follow the federal ICWA guidelines that do permit a mom to do a private placement and not notify her tribe. Now, if you match with a mom out of state, you're of course going to want to check with us about that state's laws and whether we have to notify the tribe, and then we'll do research on which tribe it is and whether they're likely to interfere. But Arizona has a lot of reservations, and so we do see it quite a bit, but we also do a lot of successful ICWA placements. So just that phrase ICWA, don't go running from it, but have that adoption professional you're working with that you can ask the follow-up questions to complete your due diligence and see if maybe it's still the right match for you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And then also finding an adoption attorney that is comfortable working with a Native American birth mother and understands the laws that apply, because not all are. So that is something you definitely want to ask from a nuanced perspective for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. Ask if they've done it before you hire any adoption attorney. Is this really what you do?
Yeah, exactly, for sure. And it's okay if you hire an adoption attorney not thinking you're going to need that particular aspect, because they can always recommend someone to consult with, right? And bring
absolutely. Yeah, we all know who the go-to people are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Sure. Are there any other tips or kind of parting thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
Sure. Maybe this is something I learned from somebody else. If you've gone through your infertility journey and you're really frustrated, make sure that you grieve that loss, the loss of the biological child that you really wanted before you really embark on your adoption journey, so that you don't bring those negative feelings over here and inadvertently project them onto the expectant mother that you're working with. Yeah. That is a fair loss and it deserves its own grief, but the adoption journey is separate and it can be beautiful, and understand it is a journey. It's not it's not a business transaction. It's not easy, but it is definitely worth it. And it's its own beautiful thing.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That was something that I really made a huge mistake on in my first kind of few months of adoption. And really, I didn't take the time to grieve. I didn't take the time to process those feelings. And honestly, it made things more difficult. So I completely agree. That's really important.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time, Kristy. Where can our audience go to learn more about you and get connected with you?
Sure. So my practice is called Stewart and Blackwell, and my law partner, Corey Stewart, is also a fellow of the Academy. So he can also help with your adoption needs. And we're in Chandler, Arizona, and we have Facebook and Instagram, and we're at stewartandblackwell.com, and you can find us online.
Awesome. And we will make sure and link to you in all of the show notes and the blog post and all of those relevant details as well. We are so thankful for your time today. We hope you have a great day.
Okay, you as well. Thank you.
Man, wasn't that conversation just amazing? We are so fortunate to have Kristy join us and really walk us through the entire process from start to finish. Remember, my friend, you are worthy of support. And if you have any questions, you can find Kristy's contact information below, or you can send me a message. Just head on over to the My Adoption Coach Facebook group or send me a DM on your favorite social platform. Remember, I'm here with you every single step of the way. I'll see you soon, friend.